welcome to my talk. I'm Andreas. I work for a consultancy company in Belgium called Ordina. And I've been contributing to a new library, well, it's about a year old or a year and a half, called Spring REST Docs. So my title is Writing Comprehensive and Guaranteed Up-to-Date REST API Documentation. That's quite a handful, but I actually want to make it a bit longer. I wanted to write Writing Comprehensive and Guaranteed Up-to-Date REST API Documentation using a test-driven approach. That's actually quite unique, and it really gives you some nice benefits when writing documentation. And I'll try to explain why in the next couple of slides. So when we're actually setting out to select a tool to write documentation, we must really think about some of the concepts and principles that really help us write good documentation, which is constantly up to date. So the most important thing in writing documentation is that it's accurate. Because I would argue that having no documentation at all is better than having inaccurate documentation. People are going to be frustrated. They're going to lose their time. They're going to, they feel like when they read your documentation, they can't trust it. So then basically they're going to ignore it. And then you just have a bunch of documentation which you can't really do anything with. So you have to have some means in the tool that we select that guarantees us that our documentation will be up to date. And using a test-driven approach, I think we can achieve this because your tests will actually fail in case your documentation is not up to date anymore. So I'll show how that works in just a bit. So then, also an important thing to get right with the tool that you choose is that it documents in the right place. It might be a bit abstract. So basically, when you have a traditional Spring MVC flow, you basically have a domain model, a POJO, which then is treated by a controller. Controller method basically has a request mapping and takes the POJO and then translates it into JSON eventually. But how that actually works is it's using a response entity. Everybody's familiar with Spring MVC? Yeah, all right. And then there's some Jackson going on if you use JSON. So that's doing some custom stuff. For instance, has some serializers, some custom serializers. It looks at some annotations on your domain model. And then eventually, you've got the HTTP response. Okay, so if you use a tool like Swagger, it actually looks at your controller. It adds some annotations there. And it tries to deduct information by doing static analysis of your code. But basically, what the flaw in that system is that it's actually in the wrong place, because you should really be documenting the HTTP response. Because Swagger, how can I actually figure out what Jackson is doing? It's by kind of trying to deduct that. But it will eventually always fail. I mean, in some of the cases, it will fail. So it would be better that we have a tool that looks at your HTTP response and your HTTP request, which actually is the place where you can be guaranteed that that's what the client is going to receive and what the client is going to send. So that should be the place. Okay? And Spring REST Docs is actually looking at that point. Okay? So that's the difference. You got to keep it dry. So your controller has to, you can't repeat yourself in the controller. Because if you do, then you're going to get out of sync, and your documentation is not going to be up to date anymore. So here you have a create and eventually an exception handler. And the create is going to return a response status created. So if you just look at the jinx of it, the create method, what you do in a tool like Swagger, is to annotate this with some documentation annotations. So here we're actually mentioning that the response can be 400 or a 201. So as you can see, you have duplication here. And if you change your bad request or create it to something else, then you have to remember to update the annotation. Okay, so that's something that could get out of sync pretty quickly. So it's also some flaw there. And actually, when we are writing documentation, it's, in my opinion, not sufficient to just have things generated. You also want to write some stuff which is functional, some real text that helps the client, the consumer of your service, to basically understand the service better. So when you're doing that, it's a good idea to write that in a tool that's actually designed for writing documentation. And Markdown or Asciidoctor, I think we all know that, either one of the two, is a great way of writing documentation, plain text, or maybe more sophisticated syntax like tables and stuff. That's actually a really easy way to do that. And if you want to do that with something else which is not really designed for that, you're going to have a hard time. Okay? So these are important things to get right. And Spring REST Docs uses the test-driven approach to achieve these things. So let's take a look at how that actually works. So first, basically write integration tests, which constantly execute. In these integration tests, you can add a hook. And you can define that when it actually does the request and response, that it uses that information that it got from that to document that stuff. I'll get into that later as well. So once you got these integration tests, it can generate information, snippets, based on what it retrieved from running the test. These snippets can then be used in a Asciidoctor or a Markdown file where you include that. So that's really simple. Then you actually write in the template, you write the stuff that is not going to change, but that's giving you more insights in the API. And the stuff that's often changing is automatically generated from the tests. So that's a nice combo there. And then eventually you compile that into an HTML. You could also do it in a PDF or whatever, which is going to be your eventual documentation. So that's the way REST Docs works. And it's really a test-driven approach. So let's look at each of the individual stages, how that actually would look like in the code. So you've here got a traditional mock MVC call. Is everybody familiar with mock MVC? Can do a show of hands? All right, yeah, that's just about everyone. So yeah, so basically this is pretty straightforward. You just do a get on you try to get the first car here, and then you're going to do assert that, this is always the stuff you're going to be doing in your integration tests. You just check if the status is okay. And then what's REST doing is actually it's using the and-do method of mock MVC to add a hook to generate some documentation. And with that, you can actually start providing some documentation with the descriptions of, for instance, the parameter with the name car ID or response fields. So, for instance, you get back response field brand, and you can here actually in this place you can describe it, and not in the production code where you would use an annotation, you would have code bloat. So there's also a possibility to reuse documentation of common fields that always come back in every request and response. And there's much more, by the way, which I'll get into later. So this is what you got in your integration test. Then this generates the snippets. Right? So these things, in this case it's Asciidoctor, can be Markdown as well. You get a curl request, which you can then display in your documentation so people can test it. You can also use HTTP, which is more sophisticated. Curl basically has also some coloring in the response and the request bodies. And this is new in 1.1, by the way. And also just the traditional HTTP request annotation. So you got request snippets. You can also do the request path parameter snippets, which will document a table automatically generated with the parameter name and the description, which is then deducted, of course, from what you entered in your test. Then response snippets will also be the similar thing as the request snippets, where you can see the response body if there's one, and you can do the same for the request body. And I mean, there's a whole bunch of snippets that are automatically generated. So here you can see the ones we already talked about: request curl, HTTP, HTTP, request fields, request path parameters, and request parameters. Sorry, the headers as well can also be generated, and request parts. If you got a multi-part request, it also is possible to generate documentation for that. On the response side, you've got response fields, hypermedia links, response headers, and response fields. I mean, I just want to get a little bit into the hypermedia links. Is anyone using hypermedia or knows about hypermedia? Okay, so not that many. Hypermedia basically allows you to link from one resource to another so that you don't have to bookmark all the URIs of all the resources. So that's a decoupling. And it's actually pretty difficult to document that because you really have to look into the response body where there's a link in the JSON, for instance. which then provides you with the URI of the other resource. And if you are taking a URI-centric approach to your documentation, if you, for instance, like what Swagger does, you display a whole list of URIs that you have available in your API, people are going to bookmark that. And that's what you want to avoid with using hypermedia. So in this approach, you basically get hypermedia links as a table in your documentation. I'll also show that in a demo later on. So this allows you to decouple much and enforce decoupling as well. So that's supported out of the box. Okay, so those are the snippets. And then let's take a look at the documentation template that you'd have to write in Asciidoctor or in Markdown. So you can see it's pretty easy to write this. You wouldn't want to write stuff in there that's going to change a lot, just some functional information to help the client developer to understand it better. And then you basically include the snippets there. So you can see path parameters and curl request snippets being included like that. So pretty straightforward, right? Okay, so once you got the template, you got the snippets, you can generate the HTML. And that looks pretty neat. It just basically formats everything for you. And it includes the snippets that you've generated. Okay, so that's basically the most important part of REST docs, how that works. Okay, so let me show a quick demo then. Okay, so it's not visible. Maybe I have to clone that. All right. Yeah, all right. Oh, wait, wrong screen. Okay, this one. All right, so we have basically a very simple application here, extremely simple. It's probably the most simple demo you're ever going to see in this conference. So we have a car controller, we've got a car and a driver. So the car, basically, it has an ID, a brand, and doors. And then you've got a car controller that basically takes, it returns the car as an API. It uses URI cars/ID. So that's really simple. It doesn't really use a backend or whatever. I'm just returning it statically. But OK, it basically is there to demonstrate what a test-driven approach would look like. So the car controller basically returns the car. I have a demo application here. Wait, a test here, sorry. The test. OK, so this basically does what I've been showing in the slides. So you've got the mock MVC call here, which does the perform, just gets the car, and it does the end expect, which asserts. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. And then we've got the end do, which can document the car and the get part of the resource. We do a pre-process response there. That's basically when it does the request or the response in mock MVC. Before you put it into a snippet, you can actually do some stuff with that. In this case, we pretty-print it so that it looks nice in the documentation. You can do a lot of stuff there, anything you're thinking about, you can think about. And then we've got links. So with the links thing, that's the hypermedia part. We can actually say that, OK, when you have that car resource, you get back a driver resource as a link as well, because every car will have a driver. Okay, and then you can document that link, what it actually does. I mean, this is pretty straightforward, simple stuff, but you can get really sophisticated in this. And then the path parameters, so the car ID and the response fields. OK, so that's straightforward. Let's run this. OK, so let's do it with Maven. You can do it as well with JUnit, doesn't matter. OK. So success, that's fine. And what it actually does in the target here, it gives you a, zoom in a bit. It gives you generated snippets. So in that folder that you mentioned here, you will get a couple of these ADoc files, which are these snippets. So if we look at those snippets, it's just what were in the slides, right? So the curl, and then with the links, you get a table, just like with the response fields or request fields. HTTP, all this stuff is there. Okay, so you've got these snippets. Now you want to generate this into an HTML so that we can actually expose this as documentation. So what you can do there is you have to write an API guides or some Asciidoc file or some Markdown file like this. So here you can see with Asciidoc that you have a lot of stuff like the doc type, which will then be a book in this case, but you can also make it a PDF or any other backend from Asciidoc, how they call it. You can also do highlighting, which is pretty neat. So if you have JSON, it will be nicely highlighted in the eventual documentation. You can also do a table of contents. So that's for free. You don't have to write that yourself. Asciidoc supplies this. It lets the client, the developer, basically navigate much easier through your big documentation. And then you've got a lot of stuff you can mention, which is probably not going to change a lot. Just some easy to write documentation. And then you get onto the actual resources where we have these inclusions. Okay, so these are the snippets that we just saw in the folder, in the target folder, and how they're actually being generated. Because I ran the test, the Maven install, I have the documentation in the generated docs, right? So here you just have the HTML. If I open that, I can show it in Chrome. Okay, so this is basically what I got generated. Okay, so it looks pretty good, and it's super easy. You just these are these little snippets, and you can do whatever you want with them in your Asciidoc file or your Markdown file. Okay, so basically that's what you want to get, and your test makes that really easy. Let me show you how it guarantees that it's up to date. So in this case, we have in our tests, hold on, let's go to our production code. In the car controller, you see that we have doors, for instance. So in the car, we have doors. Let's say I refactored the code and I removed doors. So doors are no longer supported. Right, so it's easy. So what would happen, of course, here, code will break. And now, actually, my documentation is no longer up to date. It's not in sync with the production code because it's going to document that there's going to be a doors field in the response, and the clients might actually count on that. So that's an issue, right? We want to make sure that now, if we try to deploy this, if we try to build this even, that it's going to fail. So if I do that, oh, it's failing. So here it's basically saying that, hold on, there are tests and errors, and snippet fields with the following, in this case it's not really shown well, here, yeah. So snippet exception, fields with the following path were not found in the payload, doors. So we're missing doors in the payload, so the documentation is there, but the payload isn't showing it. So that's an out-of-date issue. So basically what the solution would be is to just change the test. You can do that in the other way around as well, of course. And here, we just remove the description for doors. And then, of course, if we're going to run it, it's going to work again. And then we can just look at our documentation again. Okay, so almost done. Okay, working. Yeah. Let's check this out again. And here you can see that now there's no more doors in the response structure. Okay, so that's the guaranteed up-to-date nature of Spring REST docs. Okay, so I talked about how Spring REST docs works. Now let's see a bit of the other features that Spring REST docs can offer. We've seen that you have this HTML generated, and it's really easy to package that within your application. Of course, it's in your target folder already, but you could put it in your source main resources. So if you use Spring Boot, it would be automatically available as well for your consumer in the same application, on the same port and host. So that's really simple. It's also easy to customize the request or response before it's documented. We've seen that with this pretty print pre-processing. You can do anything there, really. So that's really simple to do. There's also support for reusing the common documentation. So you've seen in one of the slides that you can have some fields that are always recurring in every call that you're doing and everything that you want to document. that's easy to also reuse, so you don't have to repeat yourself endlessly. And then you can also add extra information to the snippets. So these snippets are by default generated, but you can change that. You can change the way they're generated. You can add extra columns to these tables, for instance. If you want to document constraints, which I'll get to later, you can just add a column and then add some extra fields or add some extra information. It's also done in the Fluent API that we saw in the integration test. So the constraints are easy to document in that approach, but you can also use a sort of introspection into annotations, which could be on your domain model, which might say it's non-null or something like that, or minimum or maximum. Although we've seen that with that approach, that you're reverting a little bit to the Swagger approach, where you're trying to deduct information, so be careful with that. But obviously, it's also possible to do that manually. And then you can also ignore parts of the request or the response during the documentation. So when you're actually, when you're getting a response back, so the payload is returned to you, then you might not want to document everything. So you can ignore certain things that are being returned to you. Okay? And then you can also pre-process that, so you can just make sure it's not even shown in the documentation. And you can also switch off failing altogether. So let's say you have a payload of 100 fields, right? And you just want to document 2 fields. Then to make sure that the documentation wouldn't fail on fields that it discovers in the payload and it didn't find in the documentation, you have to you basically have to ignore explicitly 98 fields in your integration test, which would be madness. So you can just switch off the failing in case you have that specific scenario. You can also mark parts of the request or response as optional, so that if you document them and they're not always coming back because you have a lot of different cases you want to document, then you can say, okay, this is optional. I'm not going to fail in case this field is not returned in a specific case. Okay, so this absolute guarantee that your documentation is going to be in sync with your payload or your actual request and response, you can tune that, so it's not absolute. Then we have basically support for both JSON and XML. So we've seen JSON examples, but it just as well works with XML. So that comes out of the box as well. And then now we have support for REST Assured. That's since the 1.1. So REST Assured is basically an alternative for mock MVC. But the big benefit here is that you don't need to have Spring to run Spring REST docs, because you can use REST Assured. Okay, so it used to be coupled with mock MVC, so you needed to use Spring MVC. But with REST Assured, it's no longer needed. Is anyone using REST Assured, by the way? Okay, so still a couple. All right, so you can now use Spring REST docs out of the box. And then something really interesting is you can use these snippets for stubbing purposes. You kind of have these integration tests, and they generate request and response information. And this stuff is basically a great candidate for stubbing. But brownfield, because you first have to write your API and then test it, your integration test, before it can actually start generating these snippets. So if you would want to have stubbing for a greenfield project which isn't really created yet, you wouldn't be able to use this approach. But it would be very nice to, if you have already an API, to use this, and then you can take these snippets, put them in, for instance, WireMock, and serve that to the consumers as well. And that's also going to be guaranteed up to date. Okay, so that's pretty neat, right? Okay, so basically, that was a short introduction. It's only 30 minutes. So definitely check out the repo. I can say as a contributor that really, if you contribute to this repository, it's really great to have Andy Wilkinson, the project lead, review your code. Gave me some great insights. So it's still building, but the stuff that's already there is super useful. We're using it at many of our clients, and they're all very happy with this. So this is a nice alternative to Swagger. So if you're looking for a tool, especially for hypermedia purposes, this is great. But for any other API as well, where you want to have this guaranteed up to date without intruding your code, your production code with annotations, then definitely give Spring REST docs a try. Okay, is there still time left? Yes?
Example, the error you just showed, you were removing a property. What happened if you add a new one?
Yeah, I can show you that. So for adding a property, I can quickly show that. So for instance, you have your car. What property would you want to add? Windows? Okay. Right, so you got the windows, right? Okay. And now, of course, you got to start using it. So it's basically just the other way around, and that works perfectly as well. So how many windows? 6? I don't know, 5 maybe. Okay, so now if I run this should fail again, right? So in this approach, it's going to happen exactly like that. It's going to fail because you're basically missing fields in the documentation. And it's saying that as well in a simple manner. So the following parts of the payload were not documented. And then you've got actually a snippet of the payload that you forgot. So then you just have to add that in your documentation. And that should work very simple way as well. So Windows, the amount of windows of this car, right? And then we just run this again. Now it won't fail anymore. I hope, but pretty confident. Okay, and now if I still have Chrome open somewhere, nope. Okay, let's check out the API guide. Now it's going to show this as an extra field in the table automatically. Okay, so here, windows, they're there. And they're basically a number. They're not an int, because in JSON it's the number. Okay, so you have a couple of JSON types there. Okay, yes?
Can we go back to the test?
Yes?
So, is there any way to avoid this verbose part where you find a field name? I don't know, I was thinking more like, if you annotate the closure with this description, then here you can get all this information automatically.
Yeah, but do you, okay, so the question is, can we put this description out of the tests, which makes the test more verbose, and put that in the POJO as an annotation there, as a description annotation for that field. Yeah, I mean.
Here you can just get the description generated.
Yeah, that would be a valid approach. Although it's basically just a question of where do you want to pollute code, basically. And I would argue that the production code is already full of annotations and it's already complex enough. You probably wouldn't want to put it there, although, I mean, it doesn't support it because it wants to get away from the Swagger approach where you put your production code full of annotations. So it kind of tries not to do that. Although, I mean, if you use Swagger, that's probably the way to go there because that's also in your POJO that you want to annotate stuff. But then, I mean, sometimes there are more annotations for Swagger than actual code, actual production code. So yeah, it might be something you might make an issue in the GitHub repo and see what Andy says about that. But I think this is kind of a coherent way because it's a fluent API as well. So it actually it forms a nice whole in the integration test. All right. So if there are more questions, definitely come find me. I'm going to be outside and walking around here. So thanks for your attention, guys.